This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 26. Miss Cornelia Gets a New Point of View. "Susan, after I'm dead, I'm going to come back to earth every time when the daffodils blow in this garden," said Anne rapturously. "Nobody may see me, but I'll be here, if anybody is in the garden at the time. I think I'll come on an evening just like this, but it might be just at dawn, a lovely pale pinky spring dawn. They'll just see the daffodils nodding wildly, as if an extra gust of wind had blown past them, but it will be I." "Indeed, Mrs. Dr. dear, you will not be thinking of flaunting worldly things like daffies after you are dead," said Susan. "And I do not believe in ghosts, seen or unseen." "Oh, Susan, I shall not be a ghost. That has such a horrible sound. I shall just be me, and I shall run around in the twilight, whether it is morn or eve, and see all the spots I love. Do you remember how badly I felt when I left our little house of dreams, Susan? I thought I could never love Ingleside so well, but I do. I love every inch of the ground and every stick and stone on it." "I am rather fond of the place myself," said Susan, who would have died if she had been removed from it. "But we must not set our affections too much on earthly things, Mrs. Dr. dear. There are such things as fires and earthquakes. We should always be prepared. The Tom McAllisters over harbour were burned out 3 nights ago. Some say Tom McAllister set the house on fire himself to get the insurance. That may or may not be, but I advise the doctor to have our chimneys seen to at once. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But I see Mrs. Marshall Elliott coming in at the gate, looking as if she had been sent for, and couldn't go." "Anne dearie, have you seen the Journal today?" Miss Cornelia's voice was trembling, partly from emotion, partly from the fact that she had hurried up from the store too fast and lost her breath. Anne bent over the daffodils to hide a smile. She and Gilbert had laughed heartily and heartlessly over the front page of the Journal that day, but she knew that to dear Miss Cornelia it was almost a tragedy, and she must not wound her feelings by any display of levity. "Isn't it dreadful? What is to be done?" asked Miss Cornelia despairingly. Miss Cornelia had vowed that she was done with worrying over the pranks of the manse children, but she went on worrying just the same. Anne led the way to the veranda, where Susan was knitting, with Shirley and Rilla conning their primers on either side. Susan was already on her second pair of stockings for Faith. Susan never worried over poor humanity. She did what in her lay for its betterment, and serenely left the rest to the higher powers. "Cornelia Elliott thinks she was born to run this world, Mrs. Dr. dear," she had once said to Anne, "and so she is always in a stew over something. I have never thought I was, and so I go calmly along, not but what it has sometimes occurred to me that things might be run a little better than they are. But it is not for us poor worms to nourish such thoughts. They only make us uncomfortable, and do not get us anywhere." "I don't see that anything can be done now," said Anne, pulling out a nice cushiony chair for Miss Cornelia. "But how in the world did Mr. Vickers allow that letter to be printed? Surely he should have known better." "Why, he's away, Anne dearie. He's been away to New Brunswick for a week, and that young scalawag of a Joe Vickers is editing the Journal in his absence. Of course, Mr. Vickers would never have put it in, even if he is a Methodist. But Joe would just think it a good joke. As you say, I don't suppose there is anything to be done now, only live it down. But if I ever get Joe Vickers cornered somewhere, I'll give him a talking to he won't forget in a hurry. I wanted Marshall to stop our subscription to the Journal instantly, but he only laughed and said that today's issue was the only one that had anything readable in it for a year. Marshall never will take anything seriously, just like a man. Fortunately, even Boyd is like that too. He takes it as a joke, and is laughing all over the place about it. And he's another Methodist. As for Mrs. Burr of Upper Glen, of course she will be furious, and they will leave the church. Not that it will be a great loss from any point of view. The Methodists are quite welcome to them." "It serves Mrs. Burr right," said Susan, who had an old feud with the lady in question, and had been hugely tickled over the reference to her in Faith's letter. "She will find that she will not be able to cheat the Methodist parson out of his salary with bad yarn." "The worst of it is, there's not much hope of things getting any better," said Miss Cornelia gloomily. "As long as Mr. Meredith was going to see Rosemary West, I did hope that Manse would soon have a proper mistress, but that is all off. I suppose she wouldn't have him on account of the children. At least, everybody seems to think so." "I do not believe that he ever asked her," said Susan, who could not conceive of any one refusing a minister. "Well, nobody knows anything about that. But one thing is certain, he doesn't go there any longer, and Rosemary didn't look well all the spring. I hope her visit to Kingsport will do her good. She has been gone for a month, and will stay another month, I understand. I can't remember when Rosemary was away from home before. She and Ellen could never bear to be parted, but I understand Ellen insisted on her going this time. And meanwhile Ellen and Norman Douglas are warming up the old soup." "Is that really so?" asked Anne, laughing. "I heard a rumour of it, but I hardly believed it." "Believe it! You may believe it all right, Anne dearie. Nobody is in ignorance of it. Norman Douglas never left anybody in doubt as to his intentions in regard to anything. He always did his courting before the public. He told Marshall that he hadn't thought about Ellen for years, but the first time he went to church last fall he saw her, and fell in love with her all over again. He said he'd clean forgot how handsome she was. He hadn't seen her for 20 years, if you can believe it. Of course, he never went to church, and Ellen never went anywhere else round here. Oh, we all know what Norman means, but what Ellen means is a different matter. I shan't take it upon me to predict whether it will be a match or not. He jilted her once, but it seems that does not count with some people, Mrs. Doctor dear," Susan remarked rather acidly. "He jilted her in a fit of temper and repented it all his life," said Miss Cornelia. "That is different from a cold-blooded jilting. For my part, I never detested Norman as some folks do. He could never overcrow me. I do wonder what started him coming to church. I have never been able to believe Mrs. Wilson's story, that Faith Meredith went there and bullied him into it. I've always intended to ask Faith herself, but I've never happened to think of it just when I saw her. What influence could she have over Norman Douglas? He was in the store when I left, bellowing with laughter over that scandalous letter. You could have heard him at Four Winds Point. 'The greatest girl in the world,' he was shouting. 'She's that full of spunk she's bursting with it, and all the old grannies want to tame her, darn them, but they'll never be able to do it. Never! They might as well try to drown a fish. Boyd, see that you put more fertilizer on your potatoes next year. Ho, ho, ho!' And then he laughed till the roof shook. 'Mr. Douglas pays well to the salary, at least,' remarked Susan. 'Oh, Norman isn't mean in some ways. He'd give 1,000 without blinking a lash, and roar like a bull of Bashan if he had to pay 5 cents too much for anything. Besides, he likes Mr. Meredith's sermons, and Norman Douglas was always willing to shell out if he got his brains tickled up. There is no more Christianity about him than there is about a black naked heathen in Africa, and never will be. But he's clever and well-read, and he judges sermons as he would lectures. Anyhow, it's well he backs up Mr. Meredith and the children as he does, for they'll need friends more than ever after this. I am tired of making excuses for them, believe me." "Do you know, dear Miss Cornelia," said Anne seriously, "I think we have all been making too many excuses. It is very foolish, and we ought to stop it. I'm going to tell you what I'd like to do. I shan't do it, of course." Anne had noted a glint of alarm in Susan's eye. "It would be too unconventional, and we must be conventional or die after we reach what is supposed to be a dignified age. But I'd like to do it. I'd like to call a meeting of the Ladies' Aid and W.M.S. and the Girls' Sewing Society, and include in the audience all and any Methodists who have been criticizing the Merediths, although I do think if we Presbyterians stopped criticizing and excusing, we would find that other denominations would trouble themselves very little about our Manse folks. I would say to them, 'Dear Christian friends, with marked emphasis on Christian. "I have something to say to you, and I want to say it good and hard, that you may take it home and repeat it to your families. You Methodists need not pity us, and we Presbyterians need not pity ourselves. We are not going to do it any more, and we are going to say, boldly and truthfully, to all critics and sympathizers, we are proud of our minister and his family. Mr. Meredith is the best preacher Glen St. Mary Church ever had. Moreover, he is a sincere, earnest teacher of truth and Christian charity. He is a faithful friend, a judicious pastor in all essentials, and a refined, scholarly, well-bred man. His family are worthy of him. Gerald Meredith is the cleverest pupil in the Glen School, and Mr. Hazard says that he is destined to a brilliant career. He is a manly, honourable, truthful little fellow. Faith Meredith is a beauty, and as inspiring and original as she is beautiful. There is nothing commonplace about her. All the other girls in the Glen put together haven't the vim and wit and joyousness and spunk she has. She is not an enemy in the world. Everyone who knows her loves her. Of how many, children or grown-ups, can that be said? Una Meredith is sweetness personified. She will make a most lovable woman. Carl Meredith, with his love for ants and frogs and spiders, will some day be a naturalist whom all Canada, nay, all the world, will delight to honour. Do you know of any other family in the Glen, or out of it, of whom all these things can be said? Away with shamefaced excuses and apologies. We rejoice in our minister and his splendid boys and girls." Anne stopped, partly because she was out of breath after her vehement speech, and partly because she could not trust herself to speak further in view of Miss Cornelia's face. That good lady was staring helplessly at Anne, apparently engulfed in billows of new ideas. But she came up with a gasp and struck out for shore gallantly. "Anne Blythe, I wish you would call that meeting and say just that. You've made me ashamed of myself, for one, and far be it from me to refuse to admit it. Of course, that is how we should have talked, especially to the Methodists, and it's every word of it true, every word. We've just been shutting our eyes to the big, worthwhile things and squinting them on the little things that don't really matter a pin's worth. Oh, Anne dearie, I can see a thing when it's hammered into my head. No more apologizing for Cornelia Marshall. I shall hold my head up after this, believe me, though I may talk things over with you as usual, just to relieve my feelings, if the Merediths do any more startling stunts. Even that letter I felt so bad about, why, it's only a good joke after all, as Norman says. Not many girls would have been cute enough to think of writing it, and all punctuated so nicely, and not one word misspelled. Just let me hear any Methodist say one word about it. Though, all the same, I'll never forgive Joe Vickers. Believe me, believe me. Where are the rest of your small fry tonight? Walter and the twins are in Rainbow Valley. Jem is studying in the garret. They are all crazy about Rainbow Valley. Mary Vance thinks it's the only place in the world. She'd be off up here every evening if I'd let her, but I don't encourage her in gadding. Besides, I miss the creature when she isn't around, Anne dearie. I never thought I'd get so fond of her. Not but when I see her faults and try to correct them. But she has never said one saucy word to me since she came to my house, and she is a great help. For when all is said and done, Anne dearie, I am not so young as I once was, and there is no sense denying it. I was 59 my last birthday. I don't feel it, but there is no gainsaying the family Bible. End of chapter 26. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 27. A Sacred Concert. In spite of Miss Cornelia's new point of view, she could not help feeling a little disturbed over the next performance of the manse children. In public she carried off the situation splendidly, saying to all the gossips the substance of what Anne had said in Daffodil Time, and saying it so pointedly and forcibly that her hearers found themselves feeling rather foolish, and began to think that, after all, they were making too much of a childish prank. But in private Miss Cornelia allowed herself the relief of bemoaning it to Anne. "Anne, dearie, they had a concert in the graveyard last Thursday evening, while the Methodist prayer meeting was going on. There they sat, on Hezekiah Pollock's tombstone, and sang for a solid hour. Of course, I understand it was mostly hymns they sang, and it wouldn't have been quite so bad if they'd done nothing else. But I'm told they finished up with Polly Wolly Doodle at full length, and that just when Deacon Baxter was praying." "I was there all night," said Susan, "and although I did not say anything about it to you, Mrs. Dr. dear, I could not help thinking that it was a great pity they picked that particular evening. It was truly blood-curdling to hear them sitting there in that abode of the dead, shouting that frivolous song at the top of their lungs." "I don't know what you were doing in a Methodist prayer meeting," said Miss Cornelia acidly. "I have never found that Methodism was catching," retorted Susan stiffly. "And as I was going to say when I was interrupted, badly as I felt, I did not give in to the Methodists. When Mrs. Deacon Baxter said, as we came out, 'What a disgraceful exhibition,' I said, looking her fairly in the eye, 'They are all beautiful singers, and none of your choir, Mrs. Baxter, ever bother themselves coming out to your prayer meetings, it seems. Their voices appear to be in tune only on Sundays.' She was quite meek, and I felt that I had snubbed her properly. But I could have done it much more thoroughly, Mrs. Dr. dear, if only they had left out Polly Wolly Doodle. It is truly terrible to think of that being sung in a graveyard." "Some of those dead folks sang Polly Wolly Doodle when they were living, Susan. Perhaps they like to hear it yet," suggested Gilbert. Miss Cornelia looked at him reproachfully, and made up her mind that on some future occasion she would hint to Anne that the doctor should be admonished not to say such things. They might injure his practice. People might get it into their heads that he wasn't orthodox. To be sure, Marshall said even worse things habitually, but then he was not a public man. "I understand that their father was in his study all the time, with his windows open, but never noticed them at all. Of course, he was lost in a book as usual, but I spoke to him about it yesterday when he called." "How could you dare, Mrs. Marshall Elliott?" asked Susan rebukingly. "Dare? It's time somebody dared something. Why, they say he knows nothing about that letter of Faith's to the journal, because nobody liked to mention it to him. He never looks at a journal, of course, but I thought he ought to know of this to prevent any such performances in future. He said he would discuss it with them, but of course he'd never think of it again after he got out of our gate. That man has no sense of humour, Anne, believe me. He preached last Sunday on how to bring up children. A beautiful sermon it was, too. And everybody in church thinking, 'What a pity you can't practice what you preach.'" Miss Cornelia did Mr. Meredith an injustice in thinking he would soon forget what she had told him. He went home much disturbed, and when the children came from Rainbow Valley that night, at a much later hour than they should have been prowling in it, he called them into his study. They went in, somewhat awed. It was such an unusual thing for their father to do. What could he be going to say to them? They racked their memories for any recent transgression of sufficient importance, but could not recall any. Carl had spilled a saucerful of jam on Mrs. Peter Flagg's silk dress 2 evenings before, when, at Aunt Martha's invitation, she had stayed to supper. But Mr. Meredith had not noticed it, and Mrs. Flagg, who was a kindly soul, had made no fuss. Besides, Carl had been punished by having to wear Una's dress all the rest of the evening. Una suddenly thought that perhaps her father meant to tell them that he was going to marry Miss West. Her heart began to beat violently, and her legs trembled. Then she saw that Mr. Meredith looked very stern and sorrowful. No, it could not be that. "Children," said Mr. Meredith, "I have heard something that has pained me very much. Is it true that you sat out in the graveyard all last Thursday evening, and sang ribald songs while a prayer meeting was being held in the Methodist church?" "Great Caesar, Dad! We forgot all about it being their prayer meeting night!" exclaimed Jerry in dismay. "Then it is true. You did do this thing?" "Why, Dad, I don't know what you mean by ribald songs. We sang hymns. It was a sacred concert, you know. What harm was that? I tell you, we never thought about its being Methodist prayer meeting night. They used to have their meeting Tuesday nights, and since they've changed to Thursdays, it's hard to remember." "Did you sing nothing but hymns?" "Why," said Jerry, turning red, "we did sing Polly Wolly Doodle at the last. Faith said, 'Let's have something cheerful to wind up with.' But we didn't mean any harm, Father. Truly, we didn't." "The concert was my idea, Father," said Faith, afraid that Mr. Meredith might blame Jerry too much. "You know the Methodists themselves had a sacred concert in their church 3 Sunday nights ago. I thought it would be good fun to get one up in imitation of it. Only they had prayers at theirs, and we left that part out, because we heard that people thought it awful for us to pray in a graveyard. You were sitting in here all the time," she added, "and never said a word to us." "I did not notice what you were doing. That is no excuse for me, of course. I am more to blame than you, I realize that. But why did you sing that foolish song at the end?" "We didn't think," muttered Jerry, feeling that it was a very lame excuse, seeing that he had lectured Faith so strongly in the Good Conduct Club sessions for her lack of thought. "We're sorry, Father. Truly we are. Pitch into us hard. We deserve a regular combing down." But Mr. Meredith did no combing down or pitching into. He sat down and gathered his small culprits close to him, and talked a little to them, tenderly and wisely. They were overcome with remorse and shame, and felt that they could never be so silly and thoughtless again. "We've just got to punish ourselves good and hard for this," whispered Jerry as they crept upstairs. "We'll have a session of the club first thing tomorrow and decide how we'll do it. I never saw Father so cut up. But I wish to goodness the Methodists would stick to one night for their prayer meeting and not wander all over the week. Anyhow, I'm glad it wasn't what I was afraid it was," murmured Una to herself. Behind them in the study, Mr. Meredith had sat down at his desk and buried his face in his arms. "God help me," he said. "I'm a poor sort of father. Oh, Rosemary, if you had only cared." End of chapter 27. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 28. A Fast Day. The Good Conduct Club had a special session the next morning before school. After various suggestions, it was decided that a fast day would be an appropriate punishment. "We won't eat a single thing for a whole day," said Jerry. "I'm kind of curious to see what fasting is like, anyhow. This will be a good chance to find out." "What day will we choose for it?" asked Una, who thought it would be quite an easy punishment, and rather wondered that Jerry and Faith had not devised something harder. "Let's pick Monday," said Faith. "We mostly have a pretty filling dinner on Sundays, and Monday's meals never amount to much anyhow." "But that's just the point," exclaimed Jerry. "We mustn't take the easiest day to fast, but the hardest. And that's Sunday, because, as you say, we mostly have roast beef that day instead of cold ditto. It wouldn't be much punishment to fast from ditto. Let's take next Sunday. It will be a good day, for Father is going to exchange for the morning service with the Upper Lowbridge minister. Father will be away till evening. If Aunt Martha wonders what's got into us, we'll tell her right up that we're fasting for the good of our souls, and it is in the Bible, and she is not to interfere. And I guess she won't." Aunt Martha did not. She merely said in her fretful, mumbling way, "What foolishness are you young rips up to now?" and thought no more about it. Mr. Meredith had gone away early in the morning, before anyone was up. He went without his breakfast too, but that was, of course, of common occurrence. Half of the time he forgot it, and there was no one to remind him of it. Breakfast, Aunt Martha's breakfast, was not a hard meal to miss. Even the hungry young rips did not feel it any great deprivation to abstain from the lumpy porridge and blue milk, which had aroused the scorn of Mary Vance. But it was different at dinner time. They were furiously hungry then, and the odour of roast beef, which pervaded the manse, and which was wholly delightful in spite of the fact that the roast beef was badly underdone, was almost more than they could stand. In desperation they rushed to the graveyard, where they couldn't smell it. But Una could not keep her eyes from the dining-room window, through which the Upper Lowbridge minister could be seen, placidly eating. "If I could only have just a weeny, teeny piece," she sighed. "Now you stop that," commanded Jerry. "Of course it's hard, but that's the punishment of it. I could eat a graven image this very minute, but am I complaining? Let's think of something else. We've just got to rise above our stomachs." At supper time they did not feel the pangs of hunger, which they had suffered earlier in the day. "I suppose we're getting used to it," said Faith. "I feel an awfully queer, all-gone sort of feeling, but I can't say I'm hungry." "My head is funny," said Una. "It goes round and round sometimes." But she went gamely to church with the others. If Mr. Meredith had not been so wholly wrapped up in and carried away with his subject, he might have noticed the pale little face and hollow eyes in the manse pew beneath. But he noticed nothing, and his sermon was something longer than usual. Then, just before he gave out the final hymn, Una Meredith tumbled off the seat of the manse pew, and lay in a dead faint on the floor. Mrs. Elder Clow was the first to reach her. She caught the thin little body from the arms of white-faced, terrified Faith, and carried it into the vestry. Mr. Meredith forgot the hymn and everything else, and rushed madly after her. The congregation dismissed itself as best it could. "Oh, Mrs. Clow," gasped Faith, "is Una dead? Have we killed her?" "What is the matter with my child?" demanded the pale father. "She has just fainted, I think," said Mrs. Clow. "Oh, here's the doctor, thank goodness." Gilbert did not find it a very easy thing to bring Una back to consciousness. He worked over her for a long time before her eyes opened. Then he carried her over to the manse, followed by Faith, sobbing hysterically in her relief. "She's just hungry, you know. She didn't eat a thing today. None of us did. We were all fasting." "Fasting!" said Mr. Meredith. And "Fasting?" said the doctor. "Yes, to punish ourselves for singing Polly Wolly in the graveyard." "My child, I don't want you to punish yourselves for that," said Mr. Meredith in distress. "I gave you your little scolding, and you were all penitent, and I forgave you." "Yes, but we had to be punished," explained Faith. "It's our rule, in our Good Conduct Club, you know. If we do anything wrong, or anything that is likely to hurt Father and the congregation, we have to punish ourselves. We are bringing ourselves up, you know, because there is nobody to do it." Mr. Meredith groaned, but the doctor got up from Una's side with an air of relief. "Then this child simply fainted from lack of food, and all she needs is a good square meal," he said. "Mrs. Clow, will you be kind enough to see she gets it? And I think from Faith's story that they would all be the better for something to eat, or we shall have more faintings." "I suppose we shouldn't have made Una fast," said Faith remorsefully. "When I think of it, only Jerry and I should have been punished. We got up the concert, and we were the oldest." "I sang Polly Wolly just the same as the rest of you," said Una's weak little voice, "so I had to be punished too." Mrs. Clow came with a glass of milk. Faith and Jerry and Carl sneaked off to the pantry, and John Meredith went into his study, where he sat in the darkness for a long time, alone with his bitter thoughts. So his children were bringing themselves up because there was nobody to do it, struggling along amid their little perplexities without a hand to guide or a voice to counsel. Faith's innocently uttered phrase rankled in her father's mind like a barbed shaft. There was nobody to look after them, to comfort their little souls and care for their little bodies. How frail Una had looked, lying there on the vestry sofa in that long faint. How thin were her tiny hands, how pallid her little face. She looked as if she might slip away from him in a breath, sweet little Una, of whom Cecilia had begged him to take such special care. Since his wife's death he had not felt such an agony of dread as when he had hung over his little girl in her unconsciousness. He must do something. But what? Should he ask Elizabeth Kirke to marry him? She was a good woman. She would be kind to his children. He might bring himself to do it, if it were not for his love for Rosemary West. But until he had crushed that out, he could not seek another woman in marriage. And he could not crush it out. He had tried, and he could not. Rosemary had been in church that evening, for the first time since her return from Kingsport. He had caught a glimpse of her face in the back of the crowded church, just as he had finished his sermon. His heart had given a fierce throb. He sat while the choir sang the collection piece, with his bent head and tingling pulses. He had not seen her since the evening upon which he had asked her to marry him. When he had risen to give out the hymn, his hands were trembling and his pale face was flushed. Then Una's fainting spell had banished everything from his mind for a time. Now in the darkness and solitude of the study it rushed back. Rosemary was the only woman in the world for him. It was of no use for him to think of marrying any other. He could not commit such a sacrilege, even for his children's sake. He must take up his burden alone. He must try to be a better, a more watchful father. He must tell his children not to be afraid to come to him with all their little problems. Then he lighted his lamp and took up a bulky new book which was setting the theological world by the ears. He would read just one chapter to compose his mind. 5 minutes later he was lost to the world and the troubles of the world. End of chapter 28.